The Pentagon Auditorium shimmered under unforgiving lights, the kind that made every polished metal and brass buckle gleam like fire. Rows of uniforms stretched in every direction, 1,000 officers gathered to honor tradition, to salute service, to celebrate heroes. I sat deep in the 10th row, the fabric of my uniform pressed so perfectly it cut into my skin, as though the only thing holding me together was the starch and stitching of that jacket. My name is Claire Donovan. I was 19 years old, one of the youngest officers in the military police corps. And in that room full of power and pride, I felt like an imposter hiding in plain sight. My stepfather, Richard Hale, towered in the front VIP row, his broad shoulders still squared as if he had never left active duty. Even retired, he commanded attention with his rigid posture and the permanent scowl carved into his face. At his side sat my stepbrother Luke, a fresh graduate of West Point, the heir to Richard's pride. Luke's uniform seemed to radiate approval from every direction, his smirk poised, as if he had been waiting his entire life for a stage like this. My mother Susan was there, too small and subdued, beside Richard, her eyes locked to the floor as though even she had accepted her place in silence. The ceremony rolled on with the kind of gravity that could crush someone unprepared. Speeches thundered from the podium. Medals gleamed as they were pinned on decorated chests. The audience clapped in waves that echoed off marble walls. Yet none of that grandeur reached me. For me, the air was heavy, charged with the pressure of being the Hale family disappointment. I stared down at my hands gloved and tight in my lap, whispering the mantra I had repeated for years. Just breathe. Just survive. Just stay invisible. But Richard had other plans. He rose suddenly, the scrape of his chair against the floor, cutting through the colonel's polished speech. His boots struck the ground with the force of a judge's gavel, and the entire auditorium turned. He raised one hand, not to clap, not to wave, but to command silence. His voice exploded across the sound system, magnified into a roar that made my bones vibrate. 7 languages. Utterly useless. The Army needs warriors, not bookworms. The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I could not breathe. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misheard, that no father figure would ever humiliate his own daughter so openly, but the silence that fell proved otherwise. Conversations halted. Coughs died in throats. 1,000 faces shifted to me, the invisible girl in the 10th row, suddenly pinned beneath a crushing spotlight. Luke leaned forward, the corners of his mouth curving into a smile so smug it made my stomach clench. His pride in my destruction radiated through the room. My humiliation was his victory. My mother, still in her seat, did not move. She did not flinch, did not protest. Her silence was as loud as his roar. Heat flooded my face, burning from my cheeks down to my neck. My pulse pounded in my ears until the applause and murmurs of the room blurred into a high-pitched ringing. Every pair of eyes in that auditorium weighed on me, dissecting me, branding me as the weak link, the useless daughter, the failure. The uniform that was supposed to be my shield felt like iron chains crushing my ribs. I wanted to vanish into the floor. I tried to focus on anything, the loose thread in the chair ahead of me, the soft hum of the air vents, even the faint shine of the brass insignia pinned to the colonel's chest. Anything to escape the spotlight that now burned a hole straight through me. But there was no escape. Richard's voice still thundered inside my skull. 7 languages. Useless. The Army needs warriors. His words had turned my gift, the one thing I had worked my entire life to master, into a weapon of ridicule. And he had done it not at home behind closed doors, but here, in front of the very institution I had sworn to serve. I felt stripped bare, every layer of dignity ripped from me. It was not the sting of a single insult. It was the culmination of years of being told I was weak, of being dismissed as the girl who loved words instead of fists. And now those years were crystallized into one moment of public execution orchestrated by the man who had always claimed to shape me for the better. A murmur rippled through the rows behind me. It was the sound of men and women too disciplined to gasp openly, yet unable to hide their shock. A whisper here, a shifted seat there. They all knew me now. Not for my service, not for my commitment, but as the daughter of Richard Hale, the so-called bookworm who didn't belong. My blood turned cold. I clenched my hands in my lap so tightly, my nails dug into my palms. I could not cry. Not here, not now. The tears burned at the edges of my eyes, but I swallowed them back. To cry would be to prove him right. Yet the shame was unbearable. My face felt hot enough to ignite. My chest heaved with shallow breaths, as if the air itself was poisoned with his scorn. Luke shifted in his seat beside Richard, leaning just far enough forward so I could catch his expression in the corner of my vision. The smirk had deepened, spreading across his face like a victory flag. His eyes glistened with satisfaction, the kind of cruel delight that only came from watching someone else crumble. In that instant, I saw him not as my brother, but as Richard's perfect reflection entitled arrogant and utterly convinced of his superiority. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the polished floor and escape the weight of every gaze. But my body betrayed me. My heart hammered so hard it shook my frame. My ears roared with the sound of my own pulse. My vision blurred as if the walls themselves were closing in. The humiliation was so complete, so absolute, that I felt flayed open my soul, exposed for the entire auditorium to dissect. Still through the fog of shame, one thought anchored itself in my mind. This could not be the end of my story. Richard's words might have stripped me down, but they would not define me. Somewhere beneath the crushing humiliation, anger smoldered. It was not the wild rage of a teenager desperate for approval. It was something colder, sharper, a promise forged in the wreckage of my pride. I sat frozen, my body rigid, as the colonel fumbled to recover the ceremony, yet the echo of Richard's voice lingered in the silence between each word. 7 languages. Useless. The army needs warriors. I could almost feel those words searing themselves into the fabric of my uniform, branding me as lesser, and I swore right then that one day I would make him swallow every syllable. But in that moment, in that cavernous auditorium filled with brass and silence, I did not feel powerful. I felt small, invisible, humiliated. And it was that vulnerability, that raw and searing exposure, that made what happened next so earth-shattering. The silence in the auditorium stretched until it became unbearable, like the tension before a storm breaks. My father's words still lingered in the air, heavy and poisonous. I thought the ceremony would stumble forward, pretending nothing had happened as it always did. In my house growing up, pain ignored, humiliation swept aside. But then I heard another voice. It was calm, deep, and so precise it sliced through the fog like a blade. General Hale. The sound carried without effort, without volume. And in that instant, the entire room shifted. General Shepard rose from his seat in the front row. His reputation preceded him, the 4-star commander of Army Criminal Investigation Division, a man whose authority came not from bluster, but from intellect, precision, and integrity. He did not shout. He did not need to. His presence was gravity itself. Every officer in that auditorium turned toward him, the air thick with expectation. He looked at Richard, his gaze unflinching, sharp as polished steel. Then his eyes swept across the audience until they locked with mine. The room seemed to tilt beneath me. I had never felt so seen. "Get Captain Donovan up here," Shepard said, his tone clipped and final. "We need Whisper." The word hit me like a thunderclap. Whisper. It was the code name my unit had given me, whispered half in jest at first, then in respect for my ability to hear what others missed. It was a name known only within select circles, not something that should have been spoken in this auditorium. And yet Shepard had said it in front of 1,000 officers, in front of my father and brother. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, like a ripple in water, the entire auditorium rose. Lieutenants, captains, colonels, even the generals in the VIP rows stood to their feet in one silent wave. Salutes snapped up in unison, sharp and deliberate. They weren't saluting Richard. They weren't saluting Luke. They were saluting me. I felt my body move before my mind caught up. My knees trembled as I stood, my legs heavy as if each step forward carried the weight of every insult, every dismissal I had endured. The aisle stretched before me like a gauntlet. I walked past row after row of rigid salutes, eyes locked forward, faces stern with respect. When I reached the VIP section, I saw Luke's smirk frozen on his face, contorted into disbelief. His lips parted, but no words came out. My father stood rigid in the aisle, his skin pale, his jaw tight. For the first time in my life, I saw not rage, not disdain, but shock. Pure, unfiltered shock. His iron composure cracked, revealing the man beneath, stripped of certainty. I didn't look away. I let the image of his face sear itself into my memory as I walked past him, leaving his judgment behind with every step. My chest rose with a breath that felt like my first in years. Each footfall echoed louder, stronger, until I reached the stage and stood beside General Shepard. The storm had broken. The shame that had smothered me only minutes before dissolved into something new, something steady and unshakable. For the first time since I was a child, I was not just surviving in Richard's shadow. I was standing in my own light, standing on that stage, the respectful silence of the auditorium pressing in around me. I should have felt triumph. I should have reveled in the sight of my stepfather pale and motionless, my stepbrother's smirk obliterated. Instead, the moment unlocked something buried deep inside me, something I had tried for years to bolt shut. The polished floors of the Pentagon dissolved. The lights dimmed. And suddenly I was 17 again, standing barefoot on the linoleum floor of our small house in Killeen, Texas. It was Thanksgiving, though warmth was always rationed in the Hale household. The table groaned with tradition, stuffing green beans, the golden carcass of a turkey Richard had carved with military precision. The smell of pumpkin pie cooled on the counter, a scent that should have meant comfort, but for me only sharpened the tension. At the head of the table sat Richard, as always, commanding the room like a general presiding over his troops. To his right, Luke shone with the glow of his first semester at West Point, already treated like a conquering hero. The conversations orbited him, spinning around his training, his commander's praise, his supposed promise, as though gravity itself bent toward him. I sat halfway down this table, my hands trembling in my lap, clutching an envelope. Its cream-colored paper seemed to hum with possibility, the Georgetown University crest stamped in blue like a doorway to another life. It wasn't just an acceptance letter. It was a scholarship, full tuition for their linguistics program. It was proof that my passion, my endless nights with dictionaries and tapes had value. Proof that I wasn't invisible. All day I had rehearsed how I would say it, how I would finally claim a sliver of the pride that flowed so easily to Luke. When the plates of pie were passed, I saw my moment. My voice barely rose above the clatter of forks. Dad, I have something. I slid the envelope across the table, my hands shaking. Richard picked it up, his eyes glancing at the logo without interest. He didn't open it. He didn't even pretend to. He set it down carelessly, not in a place of honor, but beside the greasy bones of the turkey where napkins were tossed and scraps discarded. The silence that followed was suffocating. I felt every eye shift, every fork pause. Richard looked straight at me, his face unreadable, then raised his voice so the entire room could hear. A scholarship in languages, he said, the words dripping with disdain, as though diagnosing an illness. He gestured with his fork toward Luke. Look at your brother. He's learning how to command men. That is the future. That is strength. What are you going to do with a piece of paper like this? Translate menus for tourists while he defends our country. The laughter that should have followed never came. Instead, relatives stared at their plates, suddenly fascinated by crumbs of pie crust. No one spoke. My cheeks burned so hot I thought I would combust. Across the table, Luke shrugged as if it meant nothing, but in his eyes I caught the glint of cruel satisfaction. He had won again. Richard stood, raising his glass high. Everyone a toast to Cadet Luke Hale, the pride and the future of this family. Glasses lifted, voices echoed. To Luke. My name wasn't spoken. My letter lay forgotten, its corner stained red where a smear of cranberry sauce had spread like blood. That night, I cried into the worn French dictionary my mother had given me before she passed away. Her voice echoed in memory, soft and steady. "Claire, your mind is a weapon. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." But in Richard's house, my weapon was a burden. It didn't make me strong. It made me a target. And that question, sharp as broken glass, cut through my grief. Why keep playing a game I could never win? On that stage, years later, standing beside General Shepard, I finally understood. That night in Killeen had planted the seed. And here, in front of the very institution Richard had used to control me, that seed was breaking open. Growing up under Richard Hale's roof was like living in a barracks where love was rationed and approval was earned only through obedience. He had been a soldier most of his life, and he never took off the uniform in his mind. His house was his base, his family his unit, and every conversation a drill. Rules were barked, not spoken. Meals were inspections. Mistakes were punishable. For Richard, strength was fists, not words, and every time he looked at me, I could see the disappointment in his eyes, as if my very existence was a flaw in his perfect formation. Luke, on the other hand, was his golden child. From the time we were kids, Richard praised him for everything. If Luke scored a touchdown in high school football, Richard would beam with pride and tell anyone who would listen about his natural leadership. If I aced a language exam, Richard would barely look up from his newspaper. "Books don't win wars, Claire," he'd mutter, dismissing me as though my efforts were a distraction from the real business of living. My mother, Susan, floated like a ghost between us. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than defiance. Richard's voice filled the house, drowning hers out until she barely spoke above a whisper. Sometimes late at night, I would find her in the kitchen staring at the wall, her hand wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold. When I asked her why she stayed, she would smile weakly and say, because leaving would only make him angrier. It was in that suffocating environment that I sharpened my weapon, the only one I was allowed: words. I buried myself in dictionaries and tapes and battered books my mother had saved from her college years. French, Spanish, German, Russian, Arabic, Pashto, Mandarin. I devoured them all, one after another, as though collecting languages might build a shield strong enough to protect me. But every time I tried to share what I had learned, Richard cut me down. "7 languages won't help you in a fight," he sneered once when I tried to translate a news broadcast for him. Luke laughed, and the sound of it rang in my ears for days. When I turned 18, I enlisted. Richard thought he had won. Finally, he said, "You'll learn what real strength looks like." He believed the Army would crush the softness out of me, mold me into something closer to Luke. But I chose the military police corps, not infantry, not armor. To Richard, that was just another failure. MPs are traffic cops in uniform, he told me, his lip curling in disgust. Not real soldiers. My first duty station was Fort Hood, Texas, renamed Fort Cavazos by the time I arrived. The base sprawled across miles of hot, dusty plains, its roads crowded with Humvees, its barracks alive with the noise of boots and shouted commands. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could make a place for myself there, away from Richard's shadow. But the Army had its own hierarchy, its own prejudices, and I quickly discovered that I was just as invisible in uniform as I had been at home. The men in my unit called me Dictionary, a nickname spat with sarcasm. When I tried to contribute during briefings, pointing out that a suspect's dialect could shift meaning, or that cultural nuance might change an interrogation, they rolled their eyes. One sergeant smirked and said, "We need MPs who can kick down doors, not professors who can parse verbs." My commanding officer agreed, relegating me to endless piles of documents translation work no one else wanted. Day after day, I sat in a cramped office listening to interrogation tapes, translating reports, my skills dismissed as a quirky hobby. I told myself I didn't mind, that the isolation was fuel that I would prove them wrong. But the truth was, I felt the same crushing loneliness I had known as a child in Richard's house. I ate alone in the mess hall. I walked back to my barracks through the Texas dust with only the sound of my boots for company. At night, I would sit on my bunk and repeat to myself, one day they will see. Fort Cavazos was a proving ground that seemed determined to break me. The days blurred into a routine of patrol rotations, stacks of paperwork, and the dull ache of being overlooked. I kept my head down and worked harder than anyone else, arriving early, staying late, taking assignments no one else wanted. But nothing pierced the wall of dismissal. The nickname dictionary followed me everywhere, echoing through the motor pool, whispered in the chow line, scrawled once across my locker door in black marker. Each time I scrubbed the ink away, the sting sank deeper. What they didn't realize was that I was building something in silence. While others mocked, I studied. I ordered my own books on psychology and nonverbal communication, paying out of pocket to build a library in my barracks room. I listened to interrogation tapes again and again, not just for the words spoken, but for the hesitations, the changes in tone, the grammatical slips that revealed more than the sentences themselves. Piece by piece, I created a system, a way to blend linguistics, culture, and psychology into something sharper than any weapon they carried. The breakthrough came one humid afternoon when a smuggling case stalled. A civilian contractor suspected of running weapons through base supply lines had been brought in. He refused to speak in English, and the few Pashto phrases my colleagues knew weren't enough. The interrogation had gone nowhere for days. The frustration in the office was palpable. Raised voices, slammed doors, reports stamped inconclusive. Finally, with no other options left, they sent for me. The room smelled of stale coffee and sweat when I walked in. The suspect sat slouched in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression hard with defiance. Two MPs hovered nearby, their eyes skeptical as I took the seat across from him. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I began to speak softly in his dialect, words shaped from years of practice late at night in my mother's old textbooks. His eyes flickered in surprise. I kept going, asking not about weapons or logistics, but about his home, his village, the poets of his valley, the folk tales he must have heard as a boy. For the first time, something cracked. His jaw tightened, then loosened. His eyes clouded with something more powerful than fear, homesickness. I recognized it because I carried it myself, the ache of belonging nowhere. Slowly, his defenses eroded. Within 2 hours, he was mapping out the entire smuggling ring, naming names, detailing routes, confirming suspicions that had eluded investigators for months. When I slid the signed confession across the table, the room went silent. The MPs who had mocked me stood slack-jawed. My commanding officer, the man who had once sneered at dictionary skills, stared at the paperwork as though it had appeared from thin air. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't need to. For the first time, there was no smirk, no dismissal, only a grudging respect that felt like the first crack in a wall I had been battering for years. I walked back to my barracks that night with the Texas wind biting at my skin, and for the first time since arriving, my chest felt lighter. It wasn't a medal or a promotion. It wasn't applause in a crowded auditorium. But it was a win, a small, quiet win carved out of years of humiliation. And that victory, humble as it was, became the foundation of everything that came after. The success of the Pashto interrogation rippled quietly through Fort Cavazos, but instead of changing everything, it only changed the edges. My commander didn't suddenly trust me. My peers didn't invite me to their tables in the mess hall. But there was a shift. A hesitation before they dismissed me, a flicker of doubt before the nickname slipped from their lips. It wasn't validation, but it was a start. A few weeks later, I was ordered to Fort Meade for a briefing on unconventional methods in ongoing investigations. The sterile conference room smelled of filtered air and hot electronics, the hum of servers filling the silence between presentations. The space was filled with sharp-eyed analysts and tech specialists, people who lived and breathed data streams, encryption keys, and algorithms. To them, human nuance was messy and unpredictable, something best avoided. When my turn came, I walked to the front with my notes clutched tightly in my hands. My heart thudded in my chest, but my voice stayed steady as I laid out my process: cultural mapping analysis of paralinguistic cues, psychological profiling through word choice. I explained how a pause at the wrong moment, a reversal of sentence structure, could reveal deception more clearly than a fingerprint. The room stayed polite, but flat heads nodding in professional acknowledgement. They saw the results, but not the art. By the time I finished, chairs were already scraping back conversations sparking as they prepared to leave. I had been tolerated nothing more, except for one man. He didn't rush to the door. He didn't glance at his phone or shuffle his papers. He just sat there, calm and steady until the room emptied. His uniform marked him as a warrant officer. His presence marked him as something different. He finally stood approaching with measured steps. "Captain Donovan," he said, his voice low but certain. "I'm Ethan Price." "May I ask you something?" I braced for the usual skepticism, but his eyes weren't mocking. They were sharp, yes, but curious. "You mentioned the suspect's deception was clear from the way he reversed sentence structure when pressed on logistics. That's not in any field manual. That's art." The word caught me off guard. For years, my work had been reduced to data points, a confession, an intel report, a tick in the success column. No one had cared how it happened. But this man, this stranger, had seen the dance behind the science. For the first time in years, I felt not dismissed, but understood. "Thank you." I managed my voice, barely more than a whisper. "Ethan," he corrected gently, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Would you have time for a coffee, Captain? I'd like to hear more about your art." I should have said no. I should have retreated to my safe cocoon of solitude. But something in his tone, something in the quiet respect he carried, made me nod. And so that evening, I found myself in a small off-base diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone Hun. Over mugs of steaming coffee, the conversation flowed with a rhythm that surprised me. Ethan spoke of code the way I spoke of language, how every programmer left behind a signature, the sloppy footprints of an amateur, the labyrinthine ego of the arrogant, the paranoid layers of the fearful. I found myself leaning forward, captivated, realizing how close our worlds really were. He decoded machines, I decoded people. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the dictionary girl or the disappointment. I was an equal. The hours slipped away in that diner without either of us noticing. The plates of pie grew cold between us, the neon light outside humming faintly, but the conversation never faltered. I told Ethan things I hadn't spoken aloud in years about the dictionaries my mother had left me, about how she used to say every language was a key to another way of seeing the world. His eyes didn't glaze over. He didn't dismiss it as trivia. He listened, leaning in as though each word mattered. In return, he told me about his own craft, how code when written well was as elegant as a sonnet, how a sloppy programmer left messy footprints in the system, how arrogance revealed itself in unnecessary complexity, how fear produced endless layers of misdirection. Machines talk, he said, his voice steady, just like people do. You just have to know how to listen. The connection felt natural, almost inevitable, like we were speaking variations of the same language. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself to someone who would never understand. I was sharing ground with someone who already did. That night, I walked back to my barracks with a warmth I hadn't felt in years, a warmth that carried me through the cold loneliness of Fort Cavazos. Our paths crossed again and again in the months that followed, sometimes in official briefings, sometimes by chance in a hallway or at the mess. Each time the conversations deepened. We spoke of literature and lines of code, of music and mission failures, of the weight of carrying skills no one seemed to value until they became indispensable. Slowly, his presence became a kind of anchor. One Saturday night, long after most of the base had gone quiet, I sat alone in my office, drowning in reports. The fluorescent lights hummed the air, stale stacks of paper surrounding me like walls. The loneliness was sharp, pressing against my ribs. Then the door opened, and Ethan stepped inside, carrying a pizza box and 2 cans of Coke. "Thought you might need this," he said simply. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't try to offer advice. He just sat down, opened his laptop, and worked beside me in silence, the smell of pepperoni filling the sterile room. It was a small act, almost mundane, but to me it was everything. It was proof that family didn't have to mean blood. It could mean someone who showed up, who shared the silence without demanding anything in return. For years, I had begged for scraps of approval from Richard, scraps of recognition from Luke. Sitting there beside Ethan, I realized I didn't need their validation anymore. I had found something stronger, respect freely given loyalty without conditions. That night, as I took the first bite of lukewarm pizza, I felt something shift. The fortress I had built around myself cracked just enough to let the warmth in, and in that warmth, I understood that I wasn't alone anymore. The call came late in the evening while I was stationed at Camp Eagle in Bosnia. The satellite phone buzzed against the desk, its shrill ring cutting through the quiet of my quarters. The number on the screen froze me where I sat. Arlington, Virginia. My stepfather had never once called me while I was deployed. Not once. For a foolish second, hope flickered. Maybe he had heard about the smuggling case I cracked. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe after years of silence and scorn, he would finally say he was proud. I took a breath, steadying my voice before I answered. Claire Richards' tone was as commanding as ever, as if he were still barking orders on the parade field. "Your brother and I are here. We need to discuss something important." Another voice came on the line, Luke's smooth and practiced, coated in false warmth. "Hey, little sister. Heard you're doing big things out there." The words oozed with condescension. The hope inside me shriveled. I should have known better. Richard got straight to the point. "You're working with Aegis Logistics, correct?" "Yes," I said cautiously. "They provide some of our comms and logistical support." "Good. There's an investigation coming down the pipeline, some complaints about faulty equipment, minor issues. I need you to soften your report, omit anything damaging, highlight their operational successes, consider it a favor to the family." His tone was matter of fact, as if he were asking me to pass the salt at dinner, but I heard the steel beneath it. It wasn't a request. It was an order. My throat tightened. "That's not just unethical," I said carefully. "It's illegal. It's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." Richard's voice sharpened instantly, slicing through the line. "Don't you lecture me about ethics, Claire. I served this country for 40 years. You're just a captain. This is how the world works. You help us, we help you. Don't forget whose name you wear on that uniform." Luke chimed in, his words dripping with smug pity. "That's right. Don't be naive. This is your chance to finally prove useful. Be a team player for once." The rage that surged inside me was cold, focused. For years, I had bent, swallowed my pride, endured humiliation to keep some shred of connection to this family. But not this. Not a felony. Not treason against everything I had sworn to protect. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting them feel the weight of it. Then I spoke, my voice low and steady. "I will not." Before either of them could respond, I ended the call. My hand trembled as I set the receiver down, but inside, something settled. A line had been drawn. A door slammed shut. And this time, I was the one who turned the key. I knew there would be consequences, but I didn't know how quickly they would come. 3 days later, I was leading a reconciliation meeting between two rival faction leaders in Bosnia. The safe house chosen for the talks was a drab concrete building on the outskirts of a small village. Its windows barred its walls, scarred from years of neglect. It was meant to be secure, anonymous, unremarkable. But from the moment we set up inside, something felt wrong. The comms system provided by Aegis Logistics had been glitchy all morning. Static hissed in my earpiece voices, cutting in and out like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I pushed the unease aside, focusing on the tense men across the table. They carried decades of blood between them, but if we could secure even a temporary truce, lives might be saved. I leaned forward, listening intently, every detail of language and tone, feeding into the fragile bridge I was trying to build. Then a voice I didn't recognize crackled into my earpiece. Serbian. Calm. Measured. Too calm. "Little whisper," the voice said. "Did you disappoint your father?" The words froze me in place. My code name. A name known only to my unit and the highest levels of command. And the one phrase that cut deeper than any bullet, the question of my father's disappointment. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a random glitch. This was deliberate. Before I could react, the world exploded. The windows shattered inward as automatic fire ripped through the air, the roar deafening the room instantly filled with smoke and splinters. Bullets chewed into the walls, shards of glass rained down, the acrid stench of cordite burning my throat. I threw myself across the table, dragging the faction leaders to the floor as my team scrambled for cover. "Get down!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, though the chaos drowned nearly everything. My shoulder ignited in white-hot pain as a round tore through my uniform, slicing flesh blood, soaking through the fabric in seconds. I gritted my teeth, forcing the pain into the background as training took over. The firefight was relentless. Whoever these attackers were, they weren't amateurs. They had us pinned in a perfect kill-box fire raining from every angle. My soldiers returned fire with discipline and courage, but we were outgunned, trapped in a storm designed to annihilate us. The suspect comms system crackled again, mocking. "Did you think you could say no?" Ice flooded my veins. This wasn't about Bosnia. It wasn't about the factions. It was about me. Someone had given them everything: our location, our timing, even the deepest wound I carried. And there was only one explanation for that. Richard. Luke. Time blurred into an eternity of smoke and blood. My team fought with ferocity, dragging the civilians toward what little cover remained, returning fire until their rifles grew hot. I pressed my back to the wall, my vision tunneling the wound in my shoulder, pulsing with each heartbeat. Yet the clarity in my mind was brutal. My own family had betrayed me. They hadn't just disowned me. They had tried to erase me. At last, the thump of rotor blades cut through the chaos. Rescue helicopters swept in their spotlights, piercing the haze, their mounted guns driving the attackers back into the tree line. The survivors among us stumbled from the ruined building, smoke trailing behind like a funeral shroud. As the medics patched my shoulder, I barely felt the sting of antiseptic or the tug of stitches. The physical wound was manageable. It was the other wound, the knowledge that my stepfather and stepbrother had orchestrated this, that hollowed me out. The report that followed called it a protocol failure, an unfortunate compromise of location. Bureaucratic fiction, but I knew better. And as I sat under the pale light of the field hospital bandage stark against my uniform, a vow formed inside me. I would not be erased. They had chosen betrayal. I would choose war. They sent me back stateside within a week, citing safety concerns. A desk assignment, the memo read, until the dust settles. In the Army, everyone knew what that meant: exile. My battlefield was gone, my reputation quietly shelved. Fort Belvoir, Virginia, greeted me with gray buildings, soulless cubicles, and mountains of mindless paperwork. To others, it might have looked like a demotion. To me, it was a gift, because I no longer saw a prison. I saw a command center. The first call I made was to Ethan. Using a secure line, I laid it all out: the phone call from Richard and Luke, their demand to falsify the Aegis report, my refusal, and the ambush that followed just 3 days later. I expected hesitation, maybe even fear. Instead, his voice was steel. "Claire," he said, low and certain. "I don't care if it's a 4-star general or the president himself. No one gets to do that to an American soldier. No one." He paused. "Send me everything you have. We're going to burn their system to the ground." From that moment, we waged our war in the shadows. By day, I filed reports and signed forms, playing the role of the forgotten captain. By night, I pored over documents, logs, and data fragments, fueled by black coffee and a fire I had never felt before. Ethan worked from Germany, slipping through encrypted servers with an artist's grace, leaving no trace but progress. I started with the grammar of deception. An old professor at Georgetown had once told me, liars always leave grammatical errors in their stories. Truth has a natural rhythm. Lies don't. So I combed through Aegis Logistics performance reports. On the surface, they were spotless, jargon-laden documents praising robust operations and operational efficacy. Too perfect. When I cross-referenced them with maintenance logs, the cracks appeared. Equipment failures disguised as user error. Damaged parts marked as routine replacement. Each inconsistency was a misplaced comma, a fractured sentence in the story Aegis wanted to tell. Meanwhile, Ethan dug into the Bosnia comm logs. The official files were flagged as corrupted, the kind of clumsy cover-up only someone arrogant enough to think no one would check could leave behind. Ethan didn't chase the missing data directly. Instead, he searched the space around its server backup's cache fragments, residual metadata. Hiding a hole in the snow, he explained one night over an encrypted call. The absence is itself proof. And sure enough, he found it. A fragment of an access log. A single line of code pointing to an unauthorized port opened and closed hours before the ambush. The trace led to a private encrypted server owned by Aegis Logistics. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was incomplete. We needed more something undeniable, something that would cut through the bureaucratic fog like Shepard's voice in the auditorium. And if Aegis had been arrogant enough to cover their tracks so sloppily, then somewhere hidden in the data their fingerprints remained. For 2 weeks, Ethan and I lived in the half-light between exhaustion and obsession. He prowled the servers overseas while I drowned in paperwork at Belvoir, both of us chasing threads that felt impossibly thin. But then one night, around 3 in the morning, my encrypted phone buzzed. Ethan's voice came through low, but charged with fury. "Claire, I've got it. I've got the son of a A file dropped into our shared vault." My hands shook as I decrypted it, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. When the audio played, my stomach turned to ice. Luke's voice, smooth and confident, filled the quiet of my office. "My father has done his part. The pressure is on. Now it's your turn. Just make sure the incident shuts her up permanently." There was a pause, then the muffled voice of the Aegis CEO, hesitant, nervous. "Isn't that risky?" Luke cut in sharply. "It's not a risk. It's a solution." The recording ended the silence afterward, louder than the gunfire in Bosnia had been. I sat, frozen, my palms clammy against the desk. There it was, proof that my stepbrother, the golden boy of the Hale family, had ordered me erased, not just dismissed, eliminated. But Ethan wasn't done. Another file appeared moments later, a scanned contract addendum. My pulse hammered as I read the authorization. It approved a massive, no-oversight budget increase for Aegis Logistics dated the day after the ambush. And at the bottom, clear and undeniable, was Richard Hale's digital signature. The betrayal was complete, laid bare in black and white. The man who had raised me with fists and contempt. The man who had sneered at my languages, mocked my scholarship, broken me down piece by piece. He hadn't just dismissed me. He had tried to profit from my destruction. I leaned back in my chair, the evidence glowing on my screen. My body trembled with a cocktail of rage and relief. All those years of being called useless, of being told I would never measure up, this was the truth that they had tried to bury. They weren't stronger. They weren't better. They were cowards hiding behind contracts and shadows. And I had caught them. But now came the question that gnawed at me, what to do with it. If I turned it over through official channels, it would vanish into red tape smothered by Richard's allies and Luke's connections. The same system that had ignored my humiliation would bury my evidence, too. I needed something else. A stage big enough, undeniable enough to make their downfall public. As if reading my thoughts, Ethan's voice came through again, steady and certain. "This isn't just about you anymore, Claire. This is about honor. If they get away with this, the rot spreads. You need to find someone who still remembers what that word means." My mind went back to the Pentagon, to the silence that had followed Shepard's command, to the way the entire room had stood when he called me Whisper. I knew then exactly who would receive the file. I compiled the audio, the contract, the log traces into one encrypted package. The subject line was simple. "General, the honor of the Army is at risk." When I hit send, my chest tightened with a strange calm. For years, I had played the game by their rules, enduring their scorn, waiting for scraps of approval. But this time, I wasn't begging for recognition. I was delivering truth like a weapon, and I knew the battlefield was about to shift. The invitation arrived on official letterhead gold seal stamped crisp against the thick parchment. Richard Hale was to be honored at the Pentagon for a lifetime achievement in service and leadership. It was the kind of recognition he had craved all his life, the validation that he was not just a soldier, but a legend. And Luke would be there at his side, basking in reflected glory, the golden sun carrying the torch forward. I should have stayed away. Part of me wanted nothing to do with that stage, that theater of hypocrisy. But another part, The part, sharpened by Bosnia's gunfire and Ethan's midnight revelations, knew this was the stage we needed. Here, in front of generals, colonels, politicians, and foreign dignitaries, the truth couldn't be buried. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, rows of uniforms gleaming under the lights. Flags stood at attention along the walls, their colors bright against the marble backdrop. Cameras lined the aisles, broadcasting the event to households across the country. It was exactly the kind of spectacle Richard adored. I sat in the 10th row, my posture rigid, my uniform pressed so sharply it felt like armor. Beside me, Ethan's presence was steady, a silent promise. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His calm anchored me as the air around us buzzed with chatter. The ceremony began with pomp and precision. A brass band played. Names of honorees were called, men and women stepped forward to receive medals, applause thundered politely through the room. And then at last came Richard. He strode onto the stage with the confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. His uniform was immaculate ribbons, gleaming, his jaw set in that familiar look of command. Luke followed a step behind his West Point posture, rigid, his eyes scanning the audience with the easy arrogance of someone who had never known failure. The announcer's voice boomed. For distinguished service and lifelong commitment to the values of the United States Army, we honor Colonel Richard Hale. Applause shook the room. Cameras flashed. Richard accepted the plaque with practiced humility, lowering his head as though the weight of honor rested on his shoulders. But I could see the pride radiating off him, the satisfaction of a man convinced he had won the game. And then General Shepard stepped forward. The air shifted. The applause tapered into silence as he moved to the podium, his 4 stars catching the light like a crown. He didn't need to speak loudly. His presence was enough to command the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shepard began, his voice measured, steady, yet carrying a weight that pressed against the chest of every person present. "We honor service today, but true honor is not in medals or titles. It is in truth. And truth must never be hidden, no matter how powerful the hands that try to bury it." A murmur rippled through the audience. Richard shifted slightly, his smile stiffening, Luke's jaw tightening. Shepard gestured, and the massive screen behind him flickered to life. Static. Then an audio file played, Luke's voice clear and sharp. "My father has done his part. The pressure is on. Now it's your turn. Just make sure the incident shuts her up permanently." The room froze. Gasps erupted, followed by a silence so profound it rang in my ears. Faces turned toward the stage, eyes wide with disbelief. Richard's head snapped toward Luke, his face draining of color. Luke stammered, his lips moving, but no words coming out. And Shepard wasn't finished. The slide shifted, revealing the scanned contract. This authorization was signed the day after Captain Claire Donovan was ambushed in Bosnia. Approved by Colonel Richard Hale himself. The words hit like artillery. The silence broke into chaos, whispers, gasps, cameras snapping furiously. The mighty Colonel Hale stood on stage, his legacy unraveling before his eyes. I sat perfectly still in my seat, my heart pounding but my face calm. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel weak. I felt seen. The auditorium erupted into a storm. Officers leaned toward one another in disbelief, whispers slicing through the silence like knives. A reporter's voice carried from the back, sharp with accusation. "Did you sign this?" Colonel Hale flashbulbs popped, freezing Richard in pale bursts of light. On the stage, Luke tried to move to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. His practiced smile had curdled into panic. He looked out over the sea of uniforms, searching for a lifeline, but there was none. His gaze even darted to mine, desperate as though I might rescue him. I didn't flinch. For the first time in my life, I owed him nothing. General Shepard raised a hand and the room fell silent again. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of final judgment. "This army will not protect corruption, not from contractors, not from officers, and not from family names." He gestured toward the side doors, and 2 military police officers marched in, their boots echoing against the marble floor. They ascended the stage with deliberate steps. When they reached Luke, the room seemed to hold its breath. The young man who had been Richard's pride, the golden son, stood frozen as the MPs pulled his arms behind his back and snapped cold steel around his wrists. The click of the handcuffs echoed louder than any applause. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Some turned their eyes away. Others leaned forward hungrily as though they couldn't believe they were witnessing the fall of a hail on live television. Richard stood rigid, his face bloodless. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came. For the first time, the booming voice that had commanded our household, that had humiliated me in public, failed him. The MPs led Luke from the stage, his head bowed, cameras flashing mercilessly. Richard remained behind his shoulders, slumped, the plaque he had been given slipping slightly in his grip. It looked heavy now, not like an honor, but like an anchor dragging him down. General Shepard's gaze swept the audience one last time. "Let this serve as a reminder," he said, "that no legacy, no reputation, and no name is greater than the truth. The Army stands for honor, and honor cannot be bought or forged, it must be lived." The words settled like stone. Applause didn't follow. Instead, the silence was thick, reverent, suffocating. And in that silence, something shifted inside me. I rose to my feet slowly, the fabric of my uniform crisp under the lights. Around me, officers began to stand too, row by row, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. They weren't applauding Richard. They weren't applauding Luke. They were saluting truth. They were saluting me. Shepard turned his eyes, meeting mine, across the sea of uniforms. He gave a single nod. Not a grand gesture, not a flourish. Just a quiet acknowledgement between soldiers who understood what had been risked, what had been won. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked back toward the stage where Richard stood broken, clutching a plaque that no longer meant anything. My stepfather, the man who had belittled my every achievement, who had tried to erase me with contracts and betrayal, was finally exposed under the same lights he once used to humiliate me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply stood in silence, letting the weight of justice speak for me. For once, the power wasn't in their voices. It was in mine, and I hadn't spoken a word. The air outside the Pentagon was sharp with a late autumn chill, the kind that cut through fabric and settled deep in the bones. Officers and civilians spilled into the courtyard in tense clusters, their conversations low and urgent. Reporters swarmed at the gates shouting questions, cameras flashing in the fading light. The tribunal had ended, but the story had only just begun. I moved through the crowd in silence, my steps steady though my body trembled with adrenaline. Ethan walked just behind me, his presence a shield against the chaos. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking out as the forgotten daughter or the overlooked soldier. I was walking out as the one who had survived, the one who had spoken without words. But survival doesn't silence the echoes. As I stepped into the corridor leading toward the outer hall, a voice rose behind me. Luke's voice, raw and desperate. "You destroyed this family," he shouted. His hands were cuffed, his face flushed with rage as the MPs guided him down the hall. He twisted in their grip, eyes locked on mine, wild and burning. "You think you won. You'll always be nothing but a traitor." I stopped meeting his stare with calm I didn't feel. My voice came out low, measured, steady. "No, Luke. You destroyed this family the moment you sold its honor for power." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, even the MPs paused, the tension coiled so tightly it seemed the walls themselves might crack. Then they dragged him forward, his curses fading into the distance until all that was left was silence. That night, Arlington was lit with headlines. Every screen, every feed carried the footage. Richard frozen under the lights, Luke in handcuffs, General Shepard's voice ringing with finality. The Hales were no longer a family of pride. They were a cautionary tale. 2 days later, I sat in a cafe not far from the base, the kind of place where businessmen hunched over laptops and mothers soothed toddlers with sippy cups. The smell of burnt espresso and cinnamon filled the air, but I barely tasted my coffee. Across the table sat Richard. He looked smaller somehow, his posture less rigid, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. He slid something across the table, a West Point ring, its gold dulled with age. His hand trembled slightly. "Claire," he said, his voice rough, stripped of its old thunder. Forget this madness. The army eats its own. You don't want to be remembered for tearing down your blood. We can still salvage something. We can still be family. I stared at the ring, its cold gleam catching the light. A symbol of everything he valued: legacy appearance, the illusion of strength. Once I might have taken it. Once I might have begged for that sliver of acceptance. But not now. I pushed it back toward him with steady hands. Honor isn't gold, Richard. It isn't a plaque or a ring. It's the choices you make when no one is watching. And you made yours. His face twisted, grief and fury warring for control. For the first time, he had no command to give, no insult sharp enough to cut me down. He simply sat there staring at the ring as though it belonged to a stranger. I stood, leaving my untouched coffee on the table. As I walked out into the crisp air, I felt the weight of years slip from my shoulders. I had spoken the words I'd been silenced from saying my whole life, and there was no taking them back. The headlines didn't fade. They multiplied, spreading across every major outlet in the country. The footage from the Pentagon Tribunal played on a loop. Richard frozen in shame. Luke dragged away in cuffs. General Shepard's words echoing like a verdict carved in stone. In the space of a single afternoon, the Hale name had gone from decorated to disgraced. 3 nights after the ceremony, I was alone in my quarters when the knock came. Ethan stood at the door, his face grim. He didn't need to speak. I felt the weight before the words left his mouth. "It's Luke," he said quietly. "They found him in his barracks this morning. He's gone." For a moment, the world tilted. I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed, my hands numb, my throat dry. I wanted to feel anger, wanted to let the same rage that had carried me through Bosnia flare again. But all I felt was a hollow ache, an echo of the boy I had once shared a kitchen table with. The boy who used to sneak cookies under the table when Richard wasn't looking. The boy who somewhere along the way had chosen pride over truth. The official report called it a sudden loss. The details were muted, the language sterile, but the whispers spread fast. Stripped of his future, his commission revoked, his reputation in ruins, Luke had seen no way forward. And so, he ended it. I attended the small memorial service, though I stood in the back, away from the cluster of Richard's old comrades. Their voices were hushed, their glances sharp, some condemning, some pitying. Richard himself stood at the front, his back stiff but his shoulders sagging as though the weight of Luke's absence pressed him into the floor. For once he looked not like a colonel, not like a commander, but like an old man who had finally realized his empire had been built on sand. As the chaplain spoke, I found myself staring at the folded flag on the altar, its stars sharp against the navy fabric. A symbol of service, of sacrifice, but also of what had been lost, not just Luke's life, but the honor that should have guided it. My chest tightened with grief I hadn't expected, because no matter the betrayal, no matter the cruelty, Luke had been my brother. And now, he was gone. When the service ended, Richard approached me. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression cracked open in a way I had never seen. For a heartbeat, I thought he might apologize, might finally say the words I had spent years waiting for. But he only shook his head, his voice barely audible. "You should have protected him." The accusation cut sharp and unfair, but I didn't flinch. I met his gaze and spoke the truth, steady and unyielding. I protected the only thing that still mattered: honor. He chose the rest. Richard said nothing more. He turned and walked away. His figure stooped, his legacy shattered. That night, as I sat at my desk with Ethan beside me, I let the silence settle. The tragedy of Luke's choice would follow me, etched into the story of my life like Bosnia's scar. But I also knew this: the cost of truth is heavy, sometimes unbearable. Yet without it, there is nothing left worth fighting for. After the tribunal and the memorial, silence became my closest companion. Not the suffocating silence of Richard's house, where every unspoken word felt like a loaded gun. Not the hostile silence of Fort Cavazos, where I had once eaten alone, the nickname dictionary buzzing in my ears. This silence was different. It was a space I had carved for myself where no one could touch me. I spent weeks at Fort Belvoir recovering my shoulder wound, knitting itself closed under layers of bandages, though the deeper wounds, the betrayal, the grief would take longer. Ethan stayed close. Sometimes we spoke for hours. Sometimes we sat in companionable quiet, both of us working the glow of screens reflecting in the dark. His presence reminded me that not all bonds were poisoned. Some were chosen. Some were real. It was Ethan who nudged me toward my next step. One evening, as we walked along the Potomac, the wind biting and the city lights glittering on the water, he spoke without preamble. "Claire, you can't carry this forever. You've done your duty. Now you need to decide who you'll be after the smoke clears." The question lingered heavy and insistent. For so long, my identity had been defined by resistance, resisting Richard's control, resisting Luke's smug superiority, resisting the Army's dismissal of my skills. I had fought to prove them wrong to survive their contempt. But who was I when the fight was finally over? The answer came unexpectedly in the form of an assignment I hadn't requested. A transfer to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, the U.S. Army Military Police School. At first, I thought it was another exile, another attempt to shuffle me out of sight. But when I arrived, the commanding officer shook my hand and said, "We'd like you to teach." Teach. The word struck me with both fear and wonder. I wasn't sure I had anything left to give. But then I stepped into the classroom for the first time, rows of young soldiers staring up at me, their notebooks open, their pens poised. And I saw myself in them, the same hunger, the same doubt, the same yearning for someone to believe their skills mattered. I taught them not just procedures and manuals, but the subtleties of listening. I showed them how a pause could betray a lie, how dialect could reveal origin, how words, when respected, could be sharper than steel. I told them stories not about my family, but about the suspects who confessed because someone finally spoke to them in their own tongue. I watched their eyes light up, watched them sit a little straighter as though realizing for the first time that their minds could be as powerful as their fists. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, a student lingered behind. She was young, maybe 19, her uniform a little too big, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. "Ma'am," she said softly, "they call me Bookworm in the barracks. They laugh at me. But after today, I don't feel so ashamed." Something inside me broke open. I put a hand on her shoulder and met her eyes. "Don't ever be ashamed of the way your mind works. One day they'll realize you were the strongest one in the room." Walking back to my quarters that evening, I felt lighter than I had in years. Because for the first time, my past wasn't a weight dragging me under. It was a lesson, a torch I could pass on. And in teaching them, I was finally learning to heal myself. The months at Fort Leonard Wood slipped into a rhythm, the days marked not by battles or tribunals, but by lessons and faces. Each class I taught built something inside me, a foundation sturdier than any recognition Richard could have withheld. The cadets began to call me Whisper, not as a taunt, but as a title of respect. It spread quietly, a nod to the name General Shepard had spoken in that cavernous hall. This time, I wore it proudly. One spring morning, I was called into the main building. The commanding officer led me down a corridor I had walked dozens of times, but this time we stopped at a door newly polished, a brass plaque gleaming against the wood. I froze as I read the engraving, "The Whisper Room." "Your methods saved lives," he said simply. "Your resilience has inspired others." We thought it fitting. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened, my vision blurred. A part of me wanted to protest, to say I wasn't worthy. But then I remembered the classroom full of cadets, the girl who had confessed her shame, the young men and women who now stood taller because of the lessons I gave them. This wasn't vanity. This was legacy. That evening, I sat alone in my quarters, the plaque still shining in my mind. My aunt had sent me a package a few weeks earlier, one I hadn't opened. With trembling hands, I untied the string and pulled out an old photograph. It was me at 10 years old, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, a battered French dictionary open in my lap. My mother had taken the picture, her handwriting scrawled on the back, Claire and her first love words. I pressed the photo against my chest, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. My mother had known even then what Richard had refused to see. She had believed in me when no one else did. Now, years later, I had made her belief real. The next morning, I pinned that photo on the wall inside the Whisper Room, just above the lectern where I taught. It hung there like a talisman, a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest weapon is the most enduring. Ethan visited often, his work keeping him in constant motion, but his loyalty unwavering. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Missouri hills, we sat on a bench outside the training grounds watching cadets jog by in cadence. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly, exposing them, paying the cost. I thought of Richard's hollow eyes at the cafe, of Luke's final outburst in the hallway, of the folded flag at the memorial. Pain twisted in my chest, but beneath it was clarity. "I regret the choices they made," I said, "but not mine. I carried the truth, and the truth carried me here." He nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt peace settle over me. Not the fragile peace of silence, but the grounded peace of survival, of choosing my own story. When I dismissed my class the next day, I lingered at the door watching them file out. They didn't know the full weight of what had brought me here, and they didn't need to. What mattered was that they walked taller, thought sharper, listened deeper. That was enough. I turned back into the room, the photo of my younger self catching the light, the brass plaque gleaming just beneath it. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I felt whole. And as I closed the door to the whisper room, I knew this would be my legacy. Not the scars left by betrayal, not the silence of humiliation, but the voices I had helped strengthen, carrying truth forward long after mine had faded. When I think back to that moment in the Pentagon, the roar of Richard's voice, the smirk on Luke's face, the 1,000 eyes turning toward me, I realized something I didn't know then. I thought the humiliation was the breaking point of my life. I thought it was the scar I would carry forever, but now I see it differently. That moment was not an ending, it was a beginning. It was the fracture that let the light in the wound, that forced me to stop living for their approval and start living for my own truth. For years, I had believed the lie that strength only meant fists and weapons, that intellect was weakness, that silence was survival. But the truth is that silence is not peace. Silence is a slow poison. Every time I swallowed my words, every time I folded myself smaller to avoid conflict, every time I let their voices define me, I was dying a little inside. It took betrayal, violence, and loss to strip away those illusions. It took walking through fire to realize that my voice, my quiet, measured, thoughtful voice, was my greatest weapon all along. What my stepfather and stepbrother never understood is this power built on control and fear will always collapse. It may look invincible for a time. It may win the applause of rooms full of people. It may even fool entire institutions. But eventually, truth arrives. And when it does, the false power crumbles like ash in the wind. I did not win by being louder than Richard. I did not win by trying to be stronger than Luke. I won by being relentless in my truth. I won by refusing to bend when it mattered most. I won by standing in the storm, whispering the words they could never erase. The irony is almost cruel. Richard mocked my languages, my ability to listen, my so-called useless mind. And yet it was those very skills that brought his empire down. It was my ability to hear what others missed, to decode what others dismissed, that uncovered his betrayal. It was the dictionary girl, the bookworm, the soft voice in the back row that proved stronger than both of them combined. That is the moral I carry forward. Your strength may not look like the world's definition of strength. You may not be the loudest in the room, the one with medals pinned to your chest, or the one with the easy praise of family and friends. But if you know who you are, if you stay true when it costs you everything, that is a kind of strength no one can take. And now I want to pause here because I know so many of you listening have carried your own silent battles. Maybe you've been mocked by your family. Maybe you've been told you were useless or weak because your gifts didn't fit someone else's idea of value. Maybe you've swallowed years of silence because speaking would bring ridicule or anger or rejection. Have you ever been in that place? Have you ever had to choose between the approval of others and the truth of yourself? If you have, I want you to tell me in the comments. Share your moment. Share the first time you realized you could not play by their rules anymore. Because this is not just my story, it's the story of anyone who has ever had to walk away from a rigged game. I'll be reading every single one. When I walk through the halls of Fort Leonard Wood now, I sometimes catch myself listening for echoes that aren't really there. The echoes of Richard's voice booming in judgment, of Luke's laughter dripping with cruelty, of my own silence when I should have spoken. But those echoes don't define me anymore. They are only ghosts, reminders of a past I survived, not a present I live in. What defines me now are the voices of my cadets, their questions, their determination, the spark of recognition when they realize that empathy is not weakness, but strength. That is the music of my life, and it drowns out every ghost. I know that for some of you watching, this ending may feel bittersweet. A father disgraced, a stepbrother gone, a family fractured beyond repair. Where is the victory in that? But let me tell you, victory is not always about winning them back. Sometimes victory is about choosing yourself, about building a new family out of loyalty, respect, and truth. My ally Ethan proved that family can be chosen. My cadets remind me every day that legacy is not blood, it's the impact we leave on others. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You are not defined by the people who rejected you. You are defined by the strength it took to rise anyway. And rise you can, even if you have to do it in whispers. Because whispers repeated long enough can shake walls and topple empires. I still keep that photograph my aunt sent me, the one of the little girl with the French dictionary. She sits on my office wall beside the plaque that reads "The Whisper Room." Every time I look at it, I think about how long I carried shame for being her. And now, finally, I feel nothing but pride. That girl survived. That girl fought back. That girl became me. So here is my question for you. Who was your younger self? Who was that boy or girl you used to be before the world told you you weren't enough? And if you could speak to them now, what would you say? Would you tell them they were stronger than they knew? Would you tell them not to give up? Would you tell them that one day their pain would become their weapon? I want you to take a moment and write it down in the comments. Not just for me, but for you and for the other people who will read it and realize they are not alone. These stories connect us. They are the threads that weave resilience across generations. And if this story resonated with you, if you saw even a sliver of your own journey reflected in mine, then I invite you to join this community. Subscribe, share your voice, and stay with us as we tell more stories of survival, of strength, of justice. Because we are not here just to be entertained. We are here to remember that even in our darkest moments there is light, and that no humiliation, no betrayal, no silence can erase the worth that lives inside you. This is not just my legacy. It can be ours. So let's keep whispering together until the world has no choice but to listen.